There is a psychic epidemic sweeping the modern world, a quiet, pervasive malady that touches the anxious heart of every city dweller, every overconnected soul, and every exhausted individual who finds themselves perpetually giving beyond their capacity. It is the epidemic we term modern anxiety, yet its roots are not modern at all. They are ancient, lying deep within the structures of the human psyche that the great Swiss psychiatrist, Carl Jung, dedicated his life to charting. He did not merely describe this anxiety, he predicted it, foreseeing the precise cultural conditions and the fatal internal errors that would eventually lead to this state of collective unrest. We must understand that your anxiety is not a personal failure. It is, as Jung would term it, a signal of an unlived life, a summons from the unconscious self demanding recognition. To truly conquer this relentless, draining state, one must cease seeking external soothing and begin the profound, terrifying, and ultimately liberating work that almost everyone ignores, the confrontation with the shadow. Let us begin by dissecting the fundamental disconnect that fuels this modern affliction. The world, in its relentless pursuit of comfort, approval, and a highly polished exterior, insists that you present a version of yourself that is both agreeable and highly functioning. This is what Jung termed the persona. The persona is the mask we wear to conform to society's expectations, and for the highly sensitive soul, the empath, or the lifelong people-pleaser, this mask is one of limitless accommodation. You learned early on that your safety and acceptance were conditional upon your relentless self-renunciation. You learned to consent when you longed to refuse. You perfected the pleasant countenance when your internal world was in distress. You became the unshakable emotional receptacle for the ill humors of every person in your orbit. This perpetual performance is the bedrock of your modern anxiety. It is the anxiety of the fabricated self, the internal tension created by the vast, unbridgeable gulf between the person you pretend to be and the person you fundamentally are. This tension, this psychological schizophrenia, is what is manifesting in your physical body as chronic exhaustion, persistent anxiety, and the profound feeling of being perpetually overwhelmed. Jung recognized that a society that places such high value on superficial harmony would inevitably cultivate a population deeply sickened by the betrayal of their own nature. He was one of the first to assert that to wear the mask too long is to become indistinguishable from the mask itself, a process that is psychologically fatal. The very energy that could be channeled into self-actualization, into realizing your unique potential, is instead perpetually siphoned outward, lubricating the social machinery and managing the emotional states of everyone else. You are, in essence, operating as an emotional sovereign for others while living as a psychological serf within your own kingdom. This is the first, most critical prediction Jung made regarding our modern sickness, the rise of the collectivized individual, the person who is defined entirely by their relationship to the group rather than by their unique, autonomous center. When the individual forfeits the responsibility for their own self-development in favor of guaranteed social acceptance, the anxiety of existential dread rushes in to fill the void. This dread is the soul's protest. It is the undeniable feeling of being lost, because the true self, the self with a capital S, has been effectively abandoned beneath the accumulated layers of the compliant persona. Jung's clinical practice was a testament to the suffering caused by this abandonment. He saw countless patients whose symptoms, the anxiety, the depression, the vague, persistent dissatisfaction, were not due to a pathology to be excised, but rather to a spiritual and psychological yearning for wholeness, for the integration of the fragmented self. The modern world, with its incessant demands for external validation through social media, constant connection, and the celebration of surface-level achievement, acts as a gigantic feedback loop, reinforcing the need for the accommodating persona. It actively discourages the solitude and introspection necessary to hear the voice of the true self. You are kept perpetually busy, perpetually distracted, perpetually outward. And the one thing that Jung insisted was the non-negotiable prerequisite for mental and spiritual health was the journey inward. He termed this essential, terrifying voyage individuation, the process by which a person becomes a single, indivisible whole, realizing their intrinsic uniqueness. But individuation begins only when the fabricated life, the life of the persona, collapses under the weight of its own contradiction. Anxiety, therefore, is not the enemy. It is the collapsing life telling you it can no longer sustain the lie. It is the internal immune system signaling a deep, structural infection. Jung's foresight was brilliant because he understood that the more comfortable and socially integrated a society became, the more psychologically fragile its members would be, having neglected the arduous, isolated task of discovering who they are, independent of external opinion. This is the silent agreement you have with the world, your performance for our approval, and the price of this agreement is your anxiety. To break the contract, one must first recognize the deep-seated, trauma-informed pattern that has enforced it, a pattern which Jung would recognize not as genuine compassion, but as what we must now term survival sensitivity. This is the critical transition point where the simple act of people-pleasing transforms into a life of psychic peril, a state that must be fully understood before the shadow work can even begin. That profound tension we just discussed, the anxiety born of the persona, is not randomly distributed. It is concentrated in the sensitive, the empathetic, and the caring. And here, we arrive at the central tragedy. The reputed gift of the highly sensitive soul is, in its initial, unconscious form, not a gift at all. It is what we must understand as survival sensitivity. It is a psychological mechanism born of environments, often in early life, where emotional safety was contingent upon becoming a perfect emotional radar. You did not develop the capacity to feel deeply out of simple benevolence, you developed it out of necessity. Your survival depended on your ability to predict the emotional shifts and needs of your caregivers, partners, or peers, allowing you to preemptively manage those states, thereby stabilizing your own environment. This hypervigilance, this constant scanning of the emotional landscape, is the true engine of your modern anxiety. Your nervous system is perpetually activated, operating on a trauma-informed setting of high alert, and the deep fatigue you feel is the exhaustion of being a full-time, unpaid emotional manager for the world. This survival sensitivity is then expertly weaponized by the outer world. Society, relationships, and even family structures quickly discover that you are a reliable source of unconditional emotional succor, a safe vessel into which others may deposit their fear, their rage, and their undealt with neuroses. And so, the transaction is established. You provide the endless emotional processing, and in return, you receive the conditional currency of acceptance, belonging, and the brief, fleeting feeling of being needed, which you mistake for being valued. This act of being needed becomes the sole manner in which the sensitive soul learns to feel a value. It is an addiction to utility, a desperate reliance on the external affirmation that comes from constant self-renunciation. Jung documented this precise pattern, noting that when an individual cannot achieve worth through self-definition, they become reliant upon the mirror of others' needs. The price of this addictive transaction is the absolute and total suppression of the true self. To maintain the role of the endless giver, the accommodating persona must excise any quality that might disrupt the narrative of flawless compassion. What must be suppressed? Any sign of self-regard, any need for rest, any expression of authentic anger, or any desire for boundaries. These vital, authentic human needs are condemned and pushed down into the deepest recesses of your psyche, a place Jung termed the shadow. The shadow, contrary to popular belief, is not just evil or wickedness. For the highly sensitive soul, the shadow is merely everything you believe you are not allowed to be. It is the repository of your denied needs, your suppressed anger, your justified fury at having been exploited, and your right to say a definitive, unapologetic no. And the more you push these essential components of self into the shadow, the more fragmented and anxious you become. Anxiety is the psychological sound barrier being broken as the contents of the suppressed shadow try desperately to push their way back into consciousness, seeking integration. Your panic attacks, your chronic guilt, your unexplained resentments, these are the tremors of the repressed self attempting to breach the surface. This is where the contrast framing is vital. You have been told your sensitivity is your strength, but we must acknowledge that, until now, it has been your greatest vulnerability, a vulnerability that others, consciously or unconsciously, exploit. To be perpetually open, perpetually receiving the emotional waste of others, is to become, as Jung hinted, psychically porous. You are operating without psychological skin. The goal of the work is not to become less sensitive, it is to become consciously selective. It is the difference between a sponge that absorbs every drop of moisture indiscriminately, and a sovereign filter that intentionally allows only what is pure and nourishing to pass through. The anxiety you feel is the physical and mental representation of this psychic overload. Your system is not designed to be the world's emotional landfill, yet you have signed up for the job out of the false belief that to stop would be to become cruel, unloving, or selfish. The true problem, then, is not the external demands, it is the internal fabrication that you are responsible for the feelings of everyone else. This fabrication, which Jung called an inflated compassion, is the result of that initial survival strategy being magnified into an entire worldview. It is a belief system so pervasive that it prevents the most crucial Jungian achievement, self-actualization. Jung was clear, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But the sensitive soul, trapped in the loop of inflated compassion, can never achieve this true self because they have never learned who they are independent of the emotions surrounding them. They confuse their role, the rescuer, the healer, the listener, with their identity. And when the role is challenged, the sensitive soul experiences an acute crisis of identity, a profound anxiety that feels like dying. In many ways, it is a death, the death of the false, accommodating self. This realization is what sets the stage for the true confrontation, The moment you realize that the most dangerous aspect of the shadow for you is not malice toward others, but the pure, unadulterated fury at having been exploited and manipulated by a world that took your goodness for granted. This rage, when integrated consciously, is not destructive. It is the powerful, protective energy required to build the boundaries that allow the true self to finally emerge from beneath the rubble of the persona, a transformation we will explore fully as we introduce the necessary terror of shadow work itself. The moment this suppressed energy of the shadow is recognized, the entire psychological landscape begins its irreversible, revolutionary shift. The recognition of survival sensitivity is merely the initial illumination. The true work, the necessary, terrifying, and ignored work, is the confrontation with the shadow. Jung explicitly stated, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For the sensitive soul, this darkness is not a cosmic evil. It is the raw, potent life force that was violently exiled because it threatened the delicate, accommodating structure of the persona. We must now turn our full attention to what is contained in your shadow, for it holds the key to dismantling the anxiety-producing fabrication and reclaiming your psychological sovereignty. For you, the most powerful and feared component of the shadow is rage. A pure, unadulterated fury at having been exploited, manipulated, and accepted only as a matter of course, as a useful object in the emotional economy of others. The modern tendency is to pathologize this rage, to label it as aggressive, unhealthy, or even selfish. But in the context of individuation for the sensitive person, this rage is the protective principle that you never developed. It is the fierce, defensive boundary energy that was suppressed every time you smiled when you wanted to scream, every time you consented when you wanted to flee, and every time you put someone else's comfort above your own psychological survival. This is the ignored cure to modern anxiety, because anxiety is the consequence of your inner protector being silenced. The moment you acknowledge the legitimacy of this suppressed fury, the moment you allow yourself to feel, deeply and honestly, the resentment, the exhaustion, and the profound injustice of your self-abandonment, the anxiety begins to lose its hold. This is the collision with the unconscious that the competitor spoke of, a sudden, profound recognition that your identity was built on a lie, the fabrication that you were responsible for the feelings of everyone else. This rage, once integrated, does not transform you into a cruel person. It transforms you into a consciously selective one. It provides the necessary assertiveness, the psychological firmness, that balances your inherent receptivity. You cease to be the psychically porous sponge, and you become the sovereign entity who can differentiate clearly between authentic need and a fabricated crisis. This integration of the shadow is what allows you to perceive manipulation tactics that were formerly invisible, to discern the emotional vampires who seek your depletion, and to distinguish genuine love from the neurotic attachment that thrives on your utility. This is not cynicism, as your anxious mind will initially try to label it. This is clarity. Jung realized that what irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. When the awakening soul realizes they were agitated by selfishness, it was because they had suppressed their own appropriate self-regard, the necessary sacred selfishness, for far too long. The process of confronting the shadow involves retrieving all those denied needs and exiled energies, the ones that were deemed too much or too burdensome. It involves accepting that you are not merely a boundless source of compassion, but a complex, whole human being with limits, needs, and a legitimate right to be fiercely protective of your own life force. When you retrieve the energy contained within that suppressed rage, it fuels your transition from the unconscious empath to the conscious sovereign. The emotional energy that was bound up in the anxiety of people-pleasing is suddenly liberated for the purpose of self-definition. This is the true energy shift. The life force begins to accumulate back within you, rather than perpetually flowing outward. You cease feeling depleted after social engagements, you cease absorbing the ill humors of others, and most significantly, you cease to feel guilt over possessing boundaries. This transformative work is what makes you dangerous to the established systems, as the competitor noted. Every individual who achieves this birth of psychological sovereignty removes themselves from the economy of self-sacrifice. They are no longer available to serve as an emotional receptacle, a human buffer, or a perpetual source of validation. The world needs unconscious individuals who can be manipulated by guilt and shame. The world does not need conscious sovereigns. Therefore, as you begin this integration, you will inevitably encounter resistance. Others, those who benefited from your accommodation, will attempt to compel you back into your former servitude through emotional pressure. They will use the language of victimhood and wounded disappointment. This is the terrifying stage Jung warned of, the loss of social approval. The death of the persona is frightening because the social mask of the accommodating, obliging person becomes untenable. You will begin to articulate your genuine thoughts, express your true preferences, and confess exhaustion instead of feigning limitless vigor. The most terrifying thing, as Jung noted, is to accept oneself completely. Yet for the individual now awakening, this terrifying self-acceptance supplants the importance of social approval as the guiding principle of their existence. This moment of standing alone, fueled by the integrated power of your shadow, is the moment you transition from being psychically reactive to psychologically mature, establishing boundaries not as walls, but as acts of individual integrity. The confrontation with the shadow initiates the rigorous, non-linear path that Jung termed individuation. It is not a gradual accrual of self-awareness, but a series of profound psychological shifts, often punctuated by moments of crisis. Jung never romanticized this process. He called it the night sea journey, a necessary period of profound disorientation, confusion, and loss that must precede the authentic rebirth of the self. For the sensitive soul who is shedding the identity of the people-pleaser, this phase feels acutely like a demise, because the life they knew, the one defined by their utility, is literally dissolving. The anxiety of this journey is intense, rooted in the mourning of relationships that were never truly founded upon affection, but on your ceaseless utility. This journey demands that boundaries become sacred, transitioning from polite suggestions into non-negotiable declarations of self-respect. The anxiety you once felt about disappointing others transforms into the quiet, firm resolve of individual integrity. You commence the practice of refusal without elaborate explanations, recognizing that those who become angered by your boundaries were, in fact, profiting from your absence of them. This is the profound understanding of sacred selfishness. Attending to your own well-being is not merely permissible, it is the prerequisite for genuine, non-neurotic connection with others. Without this self-care, any giving is merely a transaction fueled by guilt and emptiness. The awakening soul learns to heed their internal signals, the visceral discomfort, the intuitive warning, instead of submitting to external demands, developing a personal, intimate relationship with the unconscious self. This new commitment to your authentic center necessitates what we must term the great relationship purge. When you choose authenticity over approval, when you cease to display emotions you do not genuinely experience, and stop pretending agreement, you trigger a natural process of differentiation. Your new, boundaried self is a threat to those who rely on your former, compliant self. Those bonds built upon the unspoken pact, you provide endless emotional succor, we provide conditional acceptance, will inevitably dissolve. You may lose friendships that were founded only upon the version of you that served them, and you may experience periods of profound loneliness as you learn the art of being content in your own company. But Jung drew a crucial distinction. Loneliness is the anguish of disconnection from others. Solitude is the deep contentment of being connected to oneself. The anxiety of loneliness subsides as the peace of solitude takes root. The relationships that survive this purge are the conscious relationships, founded upon reciprocal respect, where your boundaries are honored and your selfhood is celebrated, not exploited. Those who truly care for you will accommodate your growth. Those who resist your change were simply deriving benefit from your neglect of self. Allow them to depart. The physical form, too, begins its long-awaited restoration. For years, the sensitive person's body served as the processing center for everyone else's emotional waste, creating energetic toxicity, chronic pain, persistent anxiety, and nervous system dysregulation. But when you cease the practice of people-pleasing, when you refuse to serve as the world's emotional landfill, the nervous system finally finds repose. Psychological restoration and physical health are inextricably linked. The diminished guilt, perhaps the most startling sign for those inclined to empathy, accompanies this restoration. The crushing burden of guilt carried for having requirements begins its slow dissipation. This is the integration of the shadow manifesting in the emotional sphere. When someone suggests you have changed in a tone of wounded disappointment, instead of rushing to soothe them, you think, "Yes, I have." And that is precisely the intent. The ultimate achievement of the night sea journey is the cultivation of conscious sensitivity. You do not forfeit your deep feeling, you learn to govern it. You retain the capacity to feel with great depth, but you exercise choice regarding what you absorb and what you release. This is the capacity to maintain one's psychological center while fully engaging with the world, a state of differentiated consciousness. Your intuitive accuracy, unclouded by the desperate need for acceptance, becomes acutely sharp. You can comprehend situations accurately without being overwhelmed by them. You can offer assistance to others without depleting your own reservoir, and you can love profoundly without losing your true self. This capacity for boundaried compassion is the final, sovereign reward of the shadow work. You possess the capacity to discern others' motives yet no longer require their affirmation. You have completed the essential, arduous task, the realization of your own inherent worth, independent of any external opinions, allowing you to return to the world as the conscious individual, ready for the ultimate integration. The ultimate objective is the integrated self. For the sensitive soul, this means embracing both the formidable and the gentle, the caring and the fiercely protective. Your sensitivity is not a frailty, it is your supreme strength, now consciously governed. Your boundaries are not selfishness, they are self-respect. You transition from giving from compulsion to giving from choice, from abundance, not emptiness. Remember the conscious empath's code: feel everything. Absorb nothing. You are not required to shoulder the world's pain to prove your goodness. The moment you cease to please all and perceive your truth, you become sovereign. Trust the process, trust your instincts, and trust that becoming who you truly are is your profound responsibility. My breaking point became my breakthrough.